introduce our speaker. David Marshak is an emeritus professor at Seattle University. He was the founding president of the Self-Designed Graduate Institute and is the author of Inviting Youth to Claim the Power of Their Imaginations, a guidebook. And David, let me know where you can find that. David has participated in observed and studied American democracy and the American history for more than 50 years. We're looking forward to his talk. It's always very thoughtful and thought-provoking. David, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jane. So let me share my screen. Get going here. Okay. There we go. Nice when it works. Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for coming. And what I'm going to do is talk for a while and introduce some of the main themes of my talk for today. And then I'll stop for questions. And then I'll talk some more. And then there'll be another opportunity for questions. And then there'll be a third part. And I haven't timed this, so but I definitely will be done before 1:30. So we'll see how it goes. So my theme is the war between the states. And what I suggest to you is that the war between the states has been a central theme in the United States of America right from the beginning, and actually from before the beginning. And in one sense, this is another variation, but in other ways, we're living in unique times. And so I will detail each of these assertions. I want to begin, though, just by saying a few things about my own orientation toward reality. Hard to say when it's sort of weird. You need to talk about that, but you know, what is reality? But anyway, obviously we do. So I believe that there are facts. There is an objective reality. There is evidence, and at the same time, there's opinion, there's analysis, there's explanation. So I'm going to make an effort to distinguish between those two claims during my talk. I used to do this when I was teaching in graduate school, and I'm out of practice. I haven't done this for a while, but I think it's really important, given the nature of this topic, to say these are facts, and then this part of it, this is David's bias, David's opinion. So speaking of bias, you know, I'm a progressive. I'm oriented toward being a progressive. You know, that's where my values are. That's where I come from. At the same time, I believe that there's value in the conservative position. I believe that the dialectic or dialogue between progressive and conservative can often be creative, and that progressives don't hold all of the truth about reality, nor do conservatives. And as a piece of evidence to support the value of the conservative position, I did a little research yesterday, and I was curious about this. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was the first one, passed in the Senate because 46 Democrats and 27 Republicans supported it. So not all the Republicans in the Senate were conservatives at that time. There were certainly Republicans from New York and Massachusetts, for example, who were essentially liberal, but the majority of the Republicans were conservative, and the Civil Rights Act would not have passed without conservative support. The same thing was true of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, supported by 30 Republicans in the Senate. So for both of these bills, the great majority of opposition came from Southern Democrats, not from Republicans. And in a minute, I'm going to explain that. The Clean Air Act of 1963 passed 89-10. The Wilderness Act of 1964 passed 73-12. And believe it or not, the Endangered Species Act in 1973 passed 100-0. So these are dramatically important pieces of legislation. One could argue these are 5 of the most important pieces of legislation put into law in the United States in the 20th century that are still affecting our lives. And they were passed with both liberal or progressive and conservative support. So my argument, my opinion, is that the majority of Republicans today are not conservatives, but they're reactionaries. And the difference is that reactionaries, by definition, are looking to a time in the past where they imagine there was a better society and they'd like to return to it. And if you recall, one of the first times this was voiced in national politics came from the eminent Vice President Dan Quayle, if you recall, who told us in 1989 about how wonderful the 1950s were. So anyway, this is context for what I'm going to present to you. So here's the 13 colonies. The revolution was essentially over 1981. The Continental Congress met again 1983, came up with the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were a disaster because they basically said that each colony had its own autonomy when it came to law and trade and commerce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was a disaster. And so when the Constitutional Congress met, they understood the problem, that they had to come up with a framework that would allow all 13 colonies, because they needed each other. They were afraid of being another attack from Great Britain. They needed each other economically. There was a vast wilderness with all these, native people who they perceived as hostile, and so on and so forth. And they were able to solve the economic issues pretty easily, which is essentially to set up the federal government and to create what we call the Commerce Clause. What became the Commerce Clause in the Constitution, which essentially says that states can't block commerce between states. But what they couldn't just come up with was what to do about slavery. And at the time, the slave states, so Maryland South, and the non-slave states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware was sort of half and half, had roughly equal populations of white people. But the southern states were not willing to enter unless there was some consideration given to their slaves, not to be citizens, for God's sake. That's an opinion, I'm sorry. I'm trying to be cleaner here. Not to be citizens, but to be counted. And so eventually they went through this whole process and came up with the 3/5 compromise, which I imagine you're familiar with, which was a really interesting bias toward the South right from the beginning. So the South got to count their slaves as 3/5 of a person when it came to the House of Representatives. So it gave the South an advantage in the House of Representatives right from the beginning. So this conflict never went away. And eventually we had a war between the states. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. I won't take any time to discuss it. After the war between the states, we had a period of Reconstruction, which is the really interesting historiography is going on about that right now. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But essentially, as has been said, I'm quoting here, I can't remember the source, the South lost the war, but they won the peace. And so we had 100 years of Jim Crow, or what evolved into Jim Crow. And so in the 1950s and 1960s, so this is when we were all alive, or, most of us were alive, maybe not everybody here, but I'm looking at faces that just about everybody I see was alive one way or another. We had another kind of war between the states. And this was about ending legal racism. And again, one of the profound one of the unique elements in our time, which I'll foreshadow right now, and I'll get into in some detail or considerable detail. You may remember that in 1962, I believe, I should have looked this up, but around there, the national news program, there was ABC and CBS and NBC, and Walter Cronkite had 15 minutes for his newscast. Huntley Brinkley had 15 minutes. I think it's 63 or 64, they got a half hour. But even think about the news environment then compared to now. Think about what this conflict about ending legal racism would have been like taking place in the information environment we have today. Obviously, it would have been a completely different national experience. Nonetheless, the introduction of television was enough to transform the way in which people in the country saw what was going on in the Jim Crow South. So, but again, this was a conflict, this was a war between the states because the states and the South wanted to hold on to Jim Crow. And again, I'm not going to go into the details, that's a different talk. And there's been an enormous amount of history written about this. So the next war between the states was the war about a war. And again, we were all alive for this one. So one of the elements that was not highlighted in the conflict internally about the war in Vietnam was, again, a lot of this war internally was a regional conflict. There was much more support in the South for the war. Nixon had partly been reelected because of the so-called Southern strategy. When Lyndon Johnson signed the 1965 Civil Rights Bill, he famously said that he was giving the South to the Republicans for a generation. Actually, it turns out for 3 generations and counting, and that's actually a fact, not an opinion. We're still there. And the South, if you look at who went to fight in Vietnam, white Southerners were vastly overrepresented, and so were African Americans. These were the 2 groups in the country who were vastly overrepresented in relation to their percentage in the population. So there was much more support for the war in Vietnam in the South, and there was much more opposition in the North and the West. So that brings us to the present, right, the present. So I'm going to argue, and this is not unique, I'm not making this up, other people have said this, so I'm just agreeing with them. And the first part, the end of a white majority and the beginning of no majority. So this is a fact. And we already live in California in this society. There's no majority ethnic racial group in California at the moment. And there hasn't been for 8 or 10 years. So the question, and this gets into what is white supremacy, what is white Christian supremacy, and I'm going to be talking about this. And obviously this gets into the realm of opinion, because clearly there are people who argue that there is no such thing as white supremacy. I believe that there is, and I'll give you an argument for that. And then the whole issue of religion comes into play, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So one of the comments, and again, this is not mine, this is from several different historical perspectives from different historians. The most dangerous period in a society is when a majority group sees itself losing its control and power, but a new power dynamic is not yet firmly in place. And this is where we are in this decade in the United States of America. So this is my opinion. Again, I don't claim it as being unique. I didn't create it, but I believe it's absolutely where we are, an accurate description. Okay, so moving right along, the future of the US is California. And here's some particulars. I'm not going to read all of this. I'll give you some time to look at it. But this data about where we are now. One of the most interesting developments is the incredible increase in people who describe themselves as being multiracial. So this was a new category. I think it showed up for the first time in 2010 and then became more available in 2020. So 34 million people, that's 10% of the population. But even without that, if you look at states predicted to have no majority group by the end of the decade, in addition to the ones already. So we're beginning to talk about a society that's like California. So one of the other dynamics that's been going on is the rise of the unchurched and a decline of Christianity. And these are two parallel but different phenomena. So membership in houses of worship has declined below 50% for the first time. And again, 70% in 1999 to 47% in 2020. This may or may not be a good thing. There's a lot of arguments to say this is not a good thing in terms of, increase in alienation. The Surgeon General just issued a report saying we have a crisis of loneliness in America. And in some ways, I bet that's related to the decline in church membership. So I'm not arguing this is an unbiasedly good thing, but it's happening one way or the other. And then a decline in individuals identifying themselves as Christians. So from, 95% to 64%. And again, many self-identified Christians are not churched. So the two large-scale trends then, the reduction in people participating in houses of worship and the reduction of people who identify as Christian. So again, if you think about particularly this notion of you're in the majority, you've been in the majority, you perceive yourself as being the majority, forever, and you see that you're no longer going to be in the majority. That's the dynamic. So I want to step back a little bit and contextualize the present in relation to previous immigration. Immigration is part of the issue now. So the first big wave came from Ireland, and basically half the people in Ireland came to the United States in the 19th century. 4 million Irish came before 1860, when the total population was only 31 million. Another almost 5 million came, between then and 1890. So almost 8 million people from Ireland came to the United States. And this is a fascinating book if you're interested in the story of Irish immigration, how the Irish became white. But it really gets at this notion of the way in which initially scorned immigrant groups find their way to joining the, quote, white mainstream population. He has a particular approach to this, which is pretty controversial. Because he says, essentially the Irish immigrants achieve acceptance among an initially hostile population only by proving they could be more brutal in their oppression of African Americans than the nativists. There are historians who disagree with him. There are historians who agree with him. It's a pretty fascinating book. But clearly, one of the ways that immigrant populations joined the mainstream was by adopting the prejudices of the mainstream. So the next group that came from Southern and Eastern Europe. And this was the biggest wave, 11.7 million. And then, 76 million, all these new folks. But the key thing, even though the country in some sense was overwhelmed by all these non-white people, because the Italians, the Jews, the Poles, and the Greeks were also seen as not white in the beginning. None of these immigrant groups were the majority. They never became the majority. The only place they were the majority was in places like Boston or New York. And it took the Irish I think, 80 years to take over the political system in Boston. The first Irish mayor was John Fitzgerald, who was John Kennedy's grandfather, Rose Kennedy's father. And the Irish mayors in Boston had Irish mayors from 1898 until last year. Really, when they elected a young Chinese American woman, So, they took over and they stayed in control for a long time. But then the population changed, and Boston, is not a majority white city anymore. So Catholics were the enemy. All these evil Catholic sexual slavery, infanticide, the Pope was going to take over, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, spread disease. This is all, if you're listening to the rhetoric about immigrants now, this is all the same stuff. There's nothing new about the rhetoric about immigration in 2023 that we haven't heard before. And again, we were all alive in 1960 and probably have some memory of how radical it was that a Catholic was going to run for president. And Jack Kennedy had to go to Dallas, the first time, not when he was shot, but the first time, and meet with a bunch of Protestant ministers and swear to them that he wasn't going to do what the Pope told him to do, in order to get elected, So this is something, again, Catholics, and then moving on to Jews, very similar, except of course, the prejudice against Jews that came from Europe was in some sense more intense than the prejudice against Catholics, and continued throughout this period, and actually continued longer. And again, is showing up again now in this decade. So these are all, we've been there. I don't know that anti-Catholicism is showing up again, but anti-Semitism is certainly showing up again. Okay, so in 1924, the white people had enough of this, and they put an end to it. Literally. So this act basically said, we're not going to have any Asians. They'd already kicked out the Chinese and the Japanese, well, not all the Japanese, the Chinese, but we're not going to have any Asians, and we're not going to have, South Americans, and we're not people from Eastern and Southern Europe. And we're just going to have Northern and Western Europeans who are white people, white Christians like us. And so this was the law for 40 years. But even so, the backlash against immigration didn't stop because the law changed. And in the second incarnation, so the first incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan was designed to destroy efforts by African Americans to hold citizenship in the Confederate States. And it was very effective. It took 20 years, but they essentially destroyed all the efforts of African Americans to hold citizenship. They took away the right to vote. They took away the right to own property, and basically created a reign of terror through lynching and burning to create the Jim Crow regime. The second incarnation was a political activity as much in the North as it was in the South. It wasn't really needed in the South because they had control in the 20s, and they were not really letting very many immigrants go there anyway. So this was a movement, California, Oregon, Indiana, Washington State, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so 1965, we're in a different era, and there is a new immigration law, which opens immigration up to the world that we've grown up in, the world we live in. So the variations in immigration law have all been, that so far, there are only a couple. The one in 86 is really the only other major one, are variations of this. But this is what's changed. This law is what's changed the country. And it grew out of the spirit of equity and ending racism that, took part in the 1960s. Okay, so let me stop there for a second and see if you have any questions. If you could put it in the chat. Let me see if there's any questions in the chat. I don't see anything, but let me give you a little time. Steve, do you want to put it in the chat? Because if I start recognizing people, it's going to be in and out, if that's okay. That's what Jane suggested. I don't know. There's not that many people, 25, we could talk, I guess. What do you think, Jane?
No. Can I just ask a question?
Sure, go ahead. Why not?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just quick on your sort of beginning history with the 13 colonies and the acceptance of slavery by the early country. It's often been my thought that this is where the problem began, when slavery was tolerated at all.
Mm-hmm.
And they started making deals. I don't know what year, maybe you can refresh me on when did they start making deals saying slavery was okay? And were there people who said in the 1780s, no, we can't have slavery in the United States, and if there are states that want it, they have to form their own country. We are not going to have a union that allows slavery. Was anybody saying that? Or was everybody saying the union was more important than the rejection of slavery?
There certainly were people saying that, and even in the Constitutional Congress, but the desperate need for the colonies to form a country together overwhelmed that, because the vulnerability, and they had won the war against Great Britain with a significant cost, but there was an enormous sense of vulnerability. Great Britain was, one of the two great world powers at the time, and its power was increasing. And there was a great deal of feeling that the British might just turn around and reinvade. And so, there was no critical mass in the Constitutional Convention not to form a country together. And it took, years. I don't have all of it in my head, but I remember there was a compromise in 1820. The issue never went away. And the issue initially was, as the country grew and states were added, it was the fight about would the new states be slave or free? And that's how the fight got played out. Really the 1820, there was another compromise, I think 1854. And the compromises didn't hold because, again, neither side was really willing. Say one more interesting thing, if in 1861, from what I understand of Abraham Lincoln, and I'm not a Lincoln scholar, but I have read a bunch about Lincoln, and is that, I don't think he would have invaded the South if the South had not seceded. I don't think he had any intention of abolishing slavery. What Lincoln wanted to do was to make sure that slavery did not become legal in the West. I think that was to end it in Texas and not let it go beyond that. And then, of course, they were fighting, but there's a lot of actual fighting going on in Kansas, bloody Kansas. So there was, just to answer your question, there was clearly opposition, but it had no critical mass at the time. It was just overwhelmed by the sense of vulnerability and anxiety.
K.S. Garda had a question about what role did the economics of slavery have to do with the Constitution allowing for slavery, particularly when everybody was worried about surviving?
Well, again, this is historiography in the last 30 years has really illustrated that the wealth in the South, to a very significant extent, came from slavery.
Yeah.
That's where the wealth came from. And the South was an extremely class differentiated society in which the wealth was held by a relatively small number of people. And the majority of white people in the South were poor. In the beginning, there were also indentured people in the South. You would be indentured, you would agree to indenturement for 7 years or 11 years, where essentially you would be the equivalent of a slave, and then you would be freed at the end. So there was a significant white indentured population. But clearly the economics of slavery was, that was the central issue. So Colleen has the question.
That indenturing is part of how people got here, right?
Right, yeah. They
got funded to come, and then they were indentured for 7 years.
Right, or 11 years. They would pay for their travel.
Their travel. And then the question, do you think the support for Catholics in recent times might reflect their reactionary behavior today as in line with the more flagrant aspects of reactionary groups, thus having less public prejudice?
That's well, having taught for 14 years at a Jesuit university, what can I say? I mean, I think, again, that Catholics, became white. I mean, to use that phrase, they became part of the mainstream. And so, like the rest of the white population, there are Catholic progressives, there are Catholic justice warriors, there are Catholic reactionaries. Catholicism is a broad fabric that is like the rest of the country, like the rest of the white people in the country. So I don't have data, about the political values of Catholics as opposed to Protestants. I know, for example, that the Catholic hierarchy in the United States is tilted toward the right because both John Paul II and Benedict, who was, John Paul's, #1 man for 20 years, appointed cardinals and bishops who, were at the right wing of American thought. But on the other hand, Francis has been Pope for 10 years now, and he's been appointing bishops and cardinals at the other end. So there's an enormous diversity in Catholics in the United States.
And we have, what, 6 of them on the Supreme Court? Or 7?
6 Catholics, I think, and 1 Jew.
I mean, that's unique, isn't it?
I don't know what happened to the Protestants. And so anyway, so let's go on here. Let me go back. Thank you. And let's go back to sharing my screen and moving right along. Okay, share. Cool. Okay, so the present day, the war between the states redux. And I'm glad that we've come to this because I've been following this for 3 months now. It's driving me crazy. I can stop following it. So gerrymandering. So this, I imagine you're already familiar with because this has had a lot of attention. And there's nothing new about gerrymandering. Democrats gerrymandered. In fact, Democrats invented gerrymandering. Elbridge Gerry was a Democrat Republican, which was the Democratic Party of the day. Gerrymandering, Democrats have done it. Republicans have done it. So what's different in the last, since 2010, is that the Republicans in 2011 began this national strategy. So it used to be, and this is one of the phenomena of our time that is somewhat unique, or maybe particularly unique, is that states used to have their own political cultures, and they used to be considerably different. So in the last 20 years in particular, Republicans, more so than Democrats, and I believe this is factually supported, have taken on a national agenda in the states. And I'm going to demonstrate that to you in subsequent minutes. So gerrymandering is part of that. And since the Supreme Court has ruled that gerrymandering is legal, states like Wisconsin and North Carolina, and which are really 50-50, or Ohio, which is 52-48, or Georgia, which is 50-50, and even Texas, which maybe is 58-42, have states where 2/3 of the state legislatures and 2/3 of the House congressional districts are Republican. Because with computers, you can figure out how to create these districts. So this is a novelty to our time. It used to be that the data were too complex to manipulate, but now it's easy to manipulate the data. And you can manipulate these districts in such a way to gerrymander. One of the ironies of this is in New York, the New York State Democratic majority in 2020 tried to gerrymander their House districts in favor of Democrats to add 5 seats. And the state courts, which are all New York, I mean, New York has been a Democratic state forever. The state courts ruled that it violated the New York State Constitution and threw out the gerrymander, which is interesting, so voting restrictions. So again, you probably have read all about, I'm not going to take the time. After the 2020 election, 19 states enacted laws to restrict voting, and then 26 states, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all states where Republicans control the legislature and the governorship. These are 2 that I'm not going into detail because you're probably mostly familiar with this already. So I'm focusing more on, well, and access to abortion as well. I imagine you're familiar with this, and then guns. So we now have 26 states where 143 million Americans live, where you can go out and buy a gun, no license, no training, no nothing, and carry it. Okay, so this I want to get into a little more detail because this you may not be as familiar with. So this is an interesting article that I found that I think illustrates the nature of the attack on transgendered people. So before 2016, you will find very little about political statements about transgender people. I looked, there's very little. So what Tara Schilling, who's the president of the American Principles Project, which is a social conservative advocacy group, is admitting in this story, he says that when the Supreme Court declared a constitutional right to same-sex marriage, social conservatives lost their primary issue. And he said, quote, "We knew we needed to find an issue that the candidates were comfortable talking about, and we threw everything at the wall. And what stuck was the issue of transgender identity." So if you think about this, this is a category that's relatively new in terms of public awareness, although obviously there have been transgender people, forever, or people with gender fluid identities forever. Obviously the medicine and research about this is new. And it's a small group of people. It's at most 1.5 million people. I don't know, I found very different data. Nobody really knows how many people, but it's 1% or less of the population. I think that's pretty clear. So this became a target. So here is my opinion. This became a target because there was a profound emotional reaction on the part of conservative Republicans about the whole notion of transgender identity and discomfort. And a lot of these same folks had become comfortable with homosexuality because so many gay and lesbian people had come out of the closet, and so many conservative Republicans found out that they had, oh, I have a cousin who's gay, or my aunt is a lesbian, or, my daughter, people found out, or my best friend. People knew people who were gay and lesbian, and the intensity of the negativity diminished, and it became less useful as a political issue. very few people knew anybody who was transgender because there weren't very many. And so this became the new emotional hot button. So this is my opinion. I believe it's absolutely true. So in addition, once the attack on trans people got going, there was some expansion of the attack from transgender back to lesbian, gays, and bisexual. Although the majority of the attack is still on transgender people. And I'm going to illustrate that. In a minute. So 7.2% of Americans identify as LGBTQ. This is a higher number in Gen Z. Gen Z are people born after 2000. Naomi Goldberg, MAP is a LGBTQ research and support group. So her belief is that this is really about forcing LGBTQ people out of public life. And this talk about predators and groomers and all that, these are emotional hot buttons that are used both in campaigns and also to raise money. Because again, one of the things to remember is that all these political groups are raising money all the time. Okay, so gender affirming healthcare. I don't have a personal opinion about gender affirming healthcare. I don't know enough about it. I know there's a controversy. I know there's a conventional wisdom among doctors and healthcare providers in the United States. I know there's some pushback against that in the United States. I know that there's some different policies in Northern Europe and Western Europe. But personally, I really don't know much about it. I do know one young adult who is transgender personally and very well, for whom that trans was one of the most wonderful things that could have happened to him. But again, I'm not going to generalize from one experience. But putting aside the contention or the disagreement about gender affirming healthcare, these are states that have banned gender affirming healthcare already in one way or another. And again, you can see which states these are. So some of the examples, in Idaho, criminalizes it, felony to provide hormones, puberty blockers, etc. Although the governor said we should take great caution whenever we consider allowing the government to interfere with loving parents. Interesting. In Mississippi, the governor says, you know, it's radical activists. And in North Dakota, the governor said, we should demonstrate compassion and understanding for all families. So these are after signing these bills. So my opinion about this is that given the fact that conservatives, again, I would say reactionaries, Republican reactionaries, have championed parents' rights for decades, the assertion of the power of the state to criminalize parents' rights when it comes to transgender issues is hypocrisy. And the reason it's being done, it may well be that some of these folks believe that what they're doing is protecting children, but clearly it's being done as a political wedge issue. Again, this is my opinion, and it works. Moving right along, critical race theory. So I imagine you've heard of critical race theory. Critical race theory is a construct that's created by law professors and other academics, and the gist of it is something that relates to intersectionality. Different forms of inequality and identity are affected by interconnections of race, class, gender, and disability, and that the United States is not a neutral society, and that we have a system of law and power that's racially discriminatory. Even though you may have individuals, you can have individuals who personally are not racist. You can have a social structure and laws and distribution of power that is institutionally racist. And this is what critical race theory argues. So it looks like some of you are reading this. I'll give you another little bit of time to get through. So what happened with critical race theory? This is actually trackable. A guy named Christopher Rufo, who made a few documentaries for PBS. Basically, it's a whole long, I won't go the whole long story, just began reading critical race theory and discovered that, oh my God, some of the academics who are writing about it were Marxists. What a thought. And he decided that he could amplify a campaign against this with support from the Manhattan Institute, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a right-wing think tank in New York, and Hillsdale College, which is a right-wing college in Michigan. And they caught on, they created this campaign, and then they got Rufo onto Sean Hannity's program, which then gave him access to a national audience, which said that critical race theory is being rammed down the throats of school children. They characterize it as teaching Black children to internalize victimhood and white children to self-identify as oppressors. So I don't know. I don't think this is even an opinion. I think this is a fact that this can be really described as a very, very effective piece of propaganda. And it's worked. And Christopher Rufo is now working for Governor DeSantis down there in Florida, as well as the Manhattan Institute. He's got a good career out of this. So we have CRT teaching bans in these states, and they're in, the legislatures are all still meeting. So I'm not exactly up to date. You know, it's all in play, but you know, all of these will pass in one form or another, I'm sure. So then moving on to DEI, the new enemy. This is like the next enemy other than CRT. So DEI has actually been around for 20 years, nothing new about it. DEI, you know, probably many of you like me began investing in the 1980s when there were the beginnings of ethical investing and ethical money market funds, ethical stock market funds that had values related to the companies they chose to invest in. So this goes back actually to 1982, sorry. And this DEI framework, companies have adopted this for 20 years. There's nothing new about this. Nothing particularly radical about it, pretty mainstream corporate and university stuff until in the last 2 years, again, the Manhattan Institute and the Goldwater Institute, and you can imagine what the Goldwater Institute is, you know, began offering draft legislation. So one of the features of the nationalization of the Republican Party is that you have these groups like Manhattan, like Goldwater, like ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange, creating draft legislation on social issues that then gets introduced in multiple states and brought into law in multiple states, the exact same legislation. So this, the anti-DEI folks say that DEI is a discriminatory ideology antithetical to the state's commitment to non-discrimination. So one of the Orwellian strategies is that you attack something by saying it's the opposite of what it is. So if you remember 1984, you know, war is peace, poor is rich, you know, et cetera, Newspeak from 1984. So this is essentially saying that paying attention to diversity is a discriminatory ideology. This is essentially newspeak. It's well done newspeak, but it is newspeak. And so banning DEI and then banning all of these terms that are part of the discourse of thinking about diversity. So implicit bias. So implicit bias has actually been studied by psychologists since the 1990s. And you can go online and find websites where you can test your own implicit bias. There's nothing new about implicit bias. It's been demonstrated, by hundreds of studies. And basically, to a large extent, it shows that most white people react to images of Black people more negatively than they react to images of white people. And vice versa. It's not just white people that have implicit bias. So saying, well, we can't say implicit bias, this is a banned word. Cultural appropriation, allyship, transgender ideology, et cetera, it's anti-racism. So this is banning the vocabulary in which people talk about diversity. This is the attempt. So I don't know. I think it's a fact to argue that this is fascism. But again, it's certainly my opinion that it's fascism. This is what fascism is. Fascism is about controlling the institutions in such a way that you control the acceptable thought or the acceptable expression. So in this case, for example, the current government of China is fascist because it expends enormous resources controlling what people can say in public. And that's what fascism is, one of the elements of fascism. So again, this guy, Doug Ritchie, DEI is a racist policy. And of course, then you just throw in Marxism for good. Okay. So DEI, here we go, moving right along, DEI prescription. Florida, DeSantis just signed it yesterday. So all of the Florida universities, all of their money for any of these programs that they've been doing for 20 years will be removed from the next fiscal year. And then these other states have variations. Okay. An example, Iowa, no, prohibits spending any state or private money on DEI officers, any work related to trainings, programmings, activities, blah, 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 race, color, ethnicity, gender, identity, or sexual orientation. So basically, all of these differentiations become banned from discourse. In a country where, very soon the majority of people are not going to be white. So this is, again, I would argue exactly what I was talking about right at the beginning, which is the effort on the part of the white people to stay in charge. This is an interesting study that just came out this week from Pew. Pew does some of the best studies, and this looked at the workplace. So in the workplace, 56% of respondents said focusing on DEI policies at work is a good thing. 28% said, who cares? Neither good nor bad. Only 16% said that such policies are bad. So interestingly, the people in the country don't seem to be concerned about this. So presumably it's the people who vote in Republican primaries who are really the target. This is an opinion. I found this data to be fascinating and hopeful that perhaps the people, we the people, are ahead of our political conflict. So history, this is what's the story? And this was the example of the 1619 Project, which began American history with the first slaves, versus the Hillsdale 1776 curriculum, which Trump had put into place. I'm going to move along here because I want to make sure that I get to the third part of this. So this is, I think, really interesting. There's this guy, Stanley Kurtz, who basically is trying to get states to ban high school projects where students interact with elected officials. Partisanship Out of Civics Act. And this is actually been passed in some states, banning, because the idea is that, you know, all these teachers are this is an overstatement for the purpose of argument. All these teachers are Marxists, and they're, you know, blah, blah, blah. And they're basically teaching their kids how to be Marxists. But the idea that students in high school can't interact with elected officials, making this illegal completely. You know, this gets to the point of, I think, of being bizarre. But again, this is happening. And then ESG, this is environmental, social, this has been going on for 20 years. It's more than $18 trillion. So at least 13 states have introduced bills to get their state money out of any fiduciaries that consider environment or social values or governance. So this is really about climate change. This is about supporting fossil fuel companies and prohibit fiduciaries, 13 states. This is a, and so this is more of the same, woke capitalism. So let's see, Texas has done this, Florida's and Arizona, all these other states. So the interesting about this is going to cost these states a lot of money because they're pulling out of most of the larger fiduciaries, the national larger banks and investment folks who are committed to ESG. And this study from Morton said it would cost Texas this amount of money in a single year on extra payment on their bonds. Whoops, go the other way here. Okay, so what I want to do, because I have this third part I want to make sure I get to, I'm just going to skip ahead here. This goes on and on. Oh, okay, just say that there are some Democratic counter initiatives, but mostly it's Republican states acting and Democratic states protecting. But there is some activity. So in Minnesota, which again has a Democratic controlled legislature and governor. Obviously in California, we amended the Constitution. New York will amend the Constitution next year. Maryland will amend the Constitution next year. Colorado just passed a bunch of bills, Massachusetts, Washington, New Jersey. In Oregon, you may have followed this, that they're trying to pass a whole bunch of bills. And the Republican senators have run away from the legislature again because, you know, that's the way they block things. But Oregon passed an initiative last year, which if senators miss more than 10 absences, they can't run for re-election. So that's in play, and it'll be seen whether or not the state courts uphold that. But Oregon would be another state that would be passed. So there is Democratic pushback, but it's really limited because again, there's not that much to do. And Democratic attorney generals have also been working together. So this is another feature of our time. The Republican attorney generals are working together, the Democrat. So this nationalization of politics is one of the features of our time. So actually, let's stop a little bit because I'm okay. I want to get into make sure I get into the internet stuff because that's a critical part of what's unique. Let's see. Sorry, Julie. Sure, I'd be happy to send you the whole PowerPoint. In fact, I'll send it to anybody that wants it, or I can send it to Jane and she can send it, however that works. So any questions about any of this state stuff?
There's a lot of it, and I think it'd be very helpful to send it to, you can send it to me or to
Okay.
Ollie and ask Ollie to send it to you.
Okay,
Just go to humboldt.edu/Ollie and ask for a copy.
Thank you. I'll do that today, later today.
Because you went quickly through a whole bunch.
I know, but
Will it go out to all of us that are here? Because I've really been
Yeah.
trying to take notes
Yeah.
and screenshots because I can't keep up. But
You'll
it's
get
a
it.
very important topic, and I
You'll
appreciate
get it. Be able to get it from Ollie, Mandy. So let me go to this third part, because this really is what's unique. This is another what's unique here. So I want to make sure I get to this. Okay, share. Okay, moving right along. Now I need to get back. There we go. Okay, so brilliant use of new media. Here are the two presidents of the United States who in the last 100 years made brilliant use of the new media. So there may be someone on the call who actually was around to hear Franklin Roosevelt in real time. I wasn't, but I remember my grandparents and my father and my mother talking about what a revelation it was to sit in their living room and listen to the president of the United States talk to them. And again, this was before that, 98% of or 99% of the people in the country never heard the president of the United States speak. Even when they began campaigning, they would just take one train trip around the country. And even if 1 million people heard them speak, less than 1%. So Franklin Roosevelt understood the revolutionary character of radio and used it. Donald Trump understood the revolutionary character of Twitter, and he used it. And he had 90 million people signed up on his account. And let's say even 15 million of them were there because they were in the media or they were people who didn't like him, but he had 70 million people who were hearing from him every day, beginning in 2014 when he began the birther campaign, or 2012, but certainly every day of his presidency, he had people hearing from him 3, 4, 5, 8, 10, 12 times a day. And I would argue, and this is my opinion, that to a large extent, the personal relationship that so many people have with Donald Trump came directly from Twitter. And that the Democratic presidents still haven't figured this out. Obama didn't understand it. Biden doesn't understand it. Hillary Clinton doesn't understand it. And of course, Twitter is a different thing now. So that's a whole different story. But Donald Trump understood Twitter and he used it brilliantly. So this next part of my talk comes from a book, The Chaos Machine. This is in the Humboldt Library System. If this intrigues you, I'd encourage you to read the book because this is going to be a quick once over. But this story basically says, and clearly there's a lot of positive in social media. So I'm not telling the positive part of the story. I assume you either know the positive part of the story or you choose not to know it. But I just want to say at the beginning, obviously, there's a lot of social connection. There's a lot of keeping track of your family. There's a lot of reconnecting with old friends. All of this wonderful, positive social connection. Absolutely. The negative part of the story is that social media is designed to promote division. And you look at this quote. So algorithms, right from the beginning, and increasing sophistication every year, basically push what the algorithm thinks you want to see next, or what wants to bring up for you next. And it bases that on an analysis of every piece of data that you put into the system up to that point. So the more that you search, or the more that you connect, the more information the algorithm has about you, and the more likely it is to bring up something related to that. Even more so, Sean Parker, who was the first president of Facebook, said, the thought process that went into building these applications was all about how do we consume as much of your time as possible. So we need to give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked you or commented on your photo or post or whatever. And that's going to get you more likes and comments. And this is exactly the kind of thing a hacker like myself would come up with, because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. So this is not accidental. This feature of social media is not accidental. This is part of the system. This is what it was created to do by people who knew what they were doing, including Mark Zuckerberg, according to Sean Parker, and he was there at the beginning. So what maximizes response? And again, this is based on a whole bunch of research that was done in the teens, the 20 teens, by multiple researchers that the reporter who wrote this book followed over a 12-year period. And the book is basically a blow-by-blow for what went on during those 12 years. And clearly, moral outrage is what creates an identity group together. We're in this together. So outrage is anger plus disgust. And moral outrage is a social control instinct. It's about us versus them. We're good, they're bad. That's what moral outrage does. And, you know, I can feel that, I can identify this in myself. I could imagine every single one of you have had this experience. Either that or you're a saint and you probably don't need to be here listening to this. You know, I understand how I'm manipulated by this. You know, I try to stay off sites that manipulate me, but once in a while, you know, it's too much of candy to overlook. So one of the pieces of research, tweets with moral emotional words traveled 20% farther for each moral emotional word. You know, angry, corrupt, disgusting, horrible. You know, groomer. Groomer is a big one. Groomer is an incredible, you know, the tweets disparaging outgroups receive much more engagement. Social media outrage is a feedback. This is the one I like. Social media outrage is a feedback loop, not unlike the apparatus used in a lab to train rats to push levers to get cocaine. Pretty good. Whoops, I get back here. Okay. So the bottom line is that social media promotes hatred and violence, and there's actual examples of this. So in Myanmar, I believe it was in I don't know the exact year, 2015, 2016, Facebook came to Myanmar. It gave free access to Facebook to everybody in the country. And people in Myanmar thought that Facebook was the internet because they had no other internet. And what Facebook generated was pogroms against the Rohingya that killed a couple 100,000 people and drove 700,000 people out of the country into these camps and, you know, next door. And this has been documented. This is not like maybe it did it. This is the exact documentation. The same thing began happening in Sri Lanka. And what they finally did in Sri Lanka, because, you know, there's a historic conflict between the Buddhists and the Muslims. In Sri Lanka, the only way that they stopped it from getting into warfare was to shut down the internet. And the same thing happened in Nigeria. So the mob effect. So we can see this in the United States. The nature of a mob effect is that people lose their regular social controls, which is called disindividuation. Thank you. And we see this on the internet all the time. Disindividuation. I'm not responsible. You know, I'm not David Marshak. I'm whatever I want to call myself on the internet. I can say whatever I want to because there's no responsibility. In Reddit in 2015, they had an interesting. They decided they wanted to do something that the whole site was full of hatred. And so they identified something called super posters. And there were about, I forget how many, 25,000 of these. Basically, people who were posting, you know, 16, 18 hours a day. You could see the characteristics. And so 15,000, I'm sorry. And they kicked them off and the hate posts went down by 80%. Okay, so algorithms are designed to take people into delusional rabbit holes. So there's been some good documentation of this. On YouTube, which is one of the worst, you can go from Jordan Peterson, and Jordan Peterson is this Canadian conservative academic media star who basically has a, what I would argue, this is an opinion, kind of a retro version of manliness, which he promotes, although he also promotes genuine conservative values as well. You can get from Jordan Peterson to explicit Nazi sites in 7 to 9 recommendations. So imagine you're a 16-year-old, or you're a 22-year-old, or you're a 24-year-old. You know, so we all know about Al-Qaeda recruiting online, but fascist neo-Nazi groups recruit online very effectively. And YouTube is one of the worst. Okay, so the other venue is Facebook groups. So Facebook groups are closed groups where nobody knows what's going on in the group. And so Facebook groups are the perfect medium for promoting conspiracies, and then to large numbers of people. And they promote moral outrage. They invite bonding about the outrage, and they promote hatred and contempt for the other. So Facebook groups are the perfect storm for conspiracy theories. And the reason that we have these conspiracy theories, I would argue, the difference between the John Birch Society in 1960, where it was a small group of a few thousand people who thought that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist and John Kennedy was a communist, and QAnon, which, you know, has some millions of people involved, or did, probably still does, or the great, you know, replacement conspiracy, I'm sorry, Stop the Steal conspiracy, which presumably 65% of Republicans still believe. The difference between these two is Facebook groups. The John Birch Society had no vehicle for reaching mass audiences. Facebook groups are really, really effective to reach a mass audience, and they have, and that's what's going on in the society today. So the self-serving claims of social media founders, our algorithm, these are quotes actually, the first two. The first one I think is Zuckerberg. The second one I don't recall. And then of course, Section 230, which the Supreme Court just had a chance to engage with, but chose not to, basically says that the internet companies have no responsibility for what individuals post. Okay, so let me just finish up here and then I'll see where we are. So where are we now? Thomas Edsall, who writes for the Times, says that Republican leaders are now adopting increasingly autocratic measures, using the police powers of government to impose moralized regulation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we see this particularly in Florida and Texas, but elsewhere. And since I'm going to send you all this, I'm going to jump ahead. I'll just skip this one, it's lengthy. So one of the issues is the Christian part of nationalism. And this is another study. This came from PRI Brookings recently. So 27% of Americans believe the US should be a Christian nation, completely or mostly agree. 40% based on Christian values, 38% if we move away from Christian, 30% being Christian is important, etc. So clearly a significant minority population is in this group. And in addition, there was a great course that Kathleen Lee and the Reverend Michael Keyes just finished last week in OLLI, exploring Christian nationalism. And if you're interested, maybe you could contact, maybe they do it again if there was an upswell of demand, because they did a wonderful job of both presenting the phenomenon of Christian nationalism. And then Michael, who is a Christian minister, did a wonderful job of critiquing Christian nationalism from the point of view of a Christian. A really wonderful course that they offered. And I'm going to skip this. We don't really need to see Alex Jones. You've seen this. The couple of comments, and I'll skip that. And this one, no, I think I'll skip Peniel too. Okay, but I'm not going to skip Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln said, and I quote, and I'm sure you've all heard this, "The house divided itself cannot stand." This was in 1860, I think, when he was running for president. "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all of one thing or all of another, of the other." So I think this is really pertinent to our time. And finally, my own view is I think that the next 6 years will be a very dangerous time for democracy, and that the continuation of the democratic governance will depend mostly on the outcome of the presidential elections and to a lesser extent the congressional elections. That all of these manifestations going on in the states will continue. And if democracy survives through 2029, the inevitable demographic changes will begin to alter the balance of power in the states away from autocracy. So the future of democracy depends completely on how citizens choose to act during these years. And I'll stop sharing at that point. Okay, so sorry for I didn't really know how long it's going to take, but I will make the PowerPoint available if anybody wants it. So we do have a few minutes.
David, that was fantastic. And boy, I really do want to see, maybe you need to do a class on this and expand it, because there was so much information here that I think we'd all come back.
Sure, I would do a class, absolutely, in the fall.
Do a class in the fall and split it up and be able to engage more with it,
Sure.
everybody, because there's an enormous amount there. And I think it'd be very interesting to go into how algorithms actually work and how AI is going to make the whole thing even worse, including everything from deep fakes to the gathering of information about us all, figuring out what we respond to and feeding it to us, and then being exclusionary. In other words, we already know that algorithms in hiring, for example, since it's based on history, and history showed the most successful people were white men because those were the only ones there, threw out all the applications from women or non-white. So those algorithms and people understanding how these algorithms work in different areas of society, how it affects your applications for loans. It's like redlining. It's a very similar process, but it's
about
way more sophisticated. Huh?
That's about 4 classes.
Right, there's a couple, so I'll think about, I'll offer 2 of them maybe. So Mandy, I just want to speak to Mandy. How do we remain hopeful? I'm actually very hopeful, Mandy. You know, I don't think there's any ultimate inevitable outcome, but the more that people are aware of what's going on, the more that people see the impact of what's going on. And so if you even look at Florida, which is, I think, a really interesting case study. In some sense, Florida is the most aggressively, and I'm going to use this word intentionally, fascist state in terms of the state government interfering in the lives of individuals, in their educational lives, in their healthcare lives, in their day-to-day lives. You know, all the legislation that's been passed in Florida this year is about the state telling people how to live, which again is not a conservative position. This historic conservative position is that the government should be less involved in telling people how to live versus the historic liberal position. So these people in Florida are not conservatives, they're reactionaries. And there's pushback in Florida, and you can see it manifesting. It's not just Disney taking their money out. There are many other activities going on in Florida in relation to people looking at what's going on and deciding that they don't want to participate in this. So I'm hopeful that, again, that the more that people become aware of what these states are doing in particular, the more that they're not going to, they're going to be happy with it and respond to it. And I mean, I purposely have avoided the whole presidential election because that's a whole different story. The one thing I will say about that is that if Donald Trump didn't exist, there would be somebody else filling that role, because the movement, the social movement, is there with him or without him. There would be other leaders. It may be not, and one could argue that perhaps it's a good thing for the country that someone as personally flawed as Donald Trump is leading that movement.
Yeah, if he were better at it, we might have a real problem.
So let's see, New Yorkers, well, yeah, some of them, Julie, but I think there's, as we go, there's more people moving out. We'll see about that. Congress is important, obviously. Okay, any other question? One more minute here. So again, I apologize for rushing through the last part. I really, I've been working on this for 3 months, and the problem is, of course, I just kept adding stuff, and I just didn't have the heart to do a dress rehearsal. So what can I say? So I will offer at least 2 class opportunities in the fall that relate to this, though, and separate it. I think that there's at least 2 different. The technology thing is really a separate issue from, and I may not be the best person to do that, but I'll think about it. But the political stuff, there's just so much going on, and it continues. So anyway, thank you very much.
And I think it'd be interesting to look at the ability of young people. I was just reading about young people and their attention span, because their constant use of smartphone and how do you grab people's attention and the attention of young people. This was fantastic.
Mhm.
And I really do appreciate your putting this together, and let's go on for the fall, because I think we're all intrigued.
I'll work on that. So thank you. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks very much, David.
Thank you.
David.
Thank you, Jane, for inviting me. So
Thanks, David.
you're welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And remember, you can contact Ollie to get a copy of the presentation.
I'll send the PowerPoint. Can I send it to you, Jane? Is that okay?
Yeah, you can send it to me.
I'll do that right now. So
Okay, that
Thanks.
works.
bye,
Anybody
everybody.
like it?
Thanks.
Thank you much.
Jane P. Woodward at AOL.com,
All right.
or send it to Ollie, either way. Thanks all for coming.
Can you say that again, your website that we can contact?
It's humboldt.edu/Ollie.
Okay. Just contact that. All right, and ask for the transcript. All right, thank you.
As for the slides,
Mhm. All
you
right.
can you can see the whole program on the Ollie website in a couple of days at humboldt.edu/Ollie/brown bags, and go to the archives.